My name is Caleb Whitfield, and 6 months ago, I thought I had my future figured out. I was supposed to begin an apprenticeship at a funeral service company in Jackson, Mississippi. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and I had spent years preparing for it. Then, 2 weeks before I was scheduled to start, the company lost funding and canceled the program without warning. Just like that, my plans disappeared. I spent the next month applying for every job I could find. Grocery stores, warehouses, gas stations. None of them were hiring. My savings shrank faster than I expected, and the overdue notices piling up on my kitchen counter became impossible to ignore. That's when I found the listing. The advertisement was surprisingly simple. Night assistant needed. Funeral home experience preferred but not required. Housing available. Immediate start. The pay was nearly double what similar positions offered. The funeral home was called Pruitt & Sons, located deep in rural Mississippi, nearly an hour from the nearest town. Desperation has a way of making strange opportunities seem reasonable, so I called the number listed. The owner answered on the second ring. His name was Garrett Pruitt. He asked only a handful of questions before telling me to come by the following afternoon. The drive there felt longer than my GPS claimed. The road narrowed until it became little more than cracked pavement cutting through endless stretches of pine forest. Eventually, I spotted the funeral home sitting alone at the edge of a small cemetery. The building looked decades older than the photographs online. Garrett was waiting on the front porch when I arrived. He was a tall man with gray hair, tired eyes, and the kind of expression that made it difficult to tell what he was thinking. He barely looked at my resume before offering me the position. "You're hired if you want it," he said. I accepted immediately. Instead of handing me employment paperwork first, Garrett reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "There are rules," he said. I almost laughed. The paper contained 7 instructions. Never embalm alone after dark. Never answer a knock from an empty viewing room. Keep the preparation room at exactly 62 degrees. Never say a deceased person's full name 3 times. Several others followed. I scanned the list twice before looking up. "Local traditions?" I asked. Garrett studied me for a moment. "You can call them whatever helps you sleep." Something about his tone unsettled me. Still, I needed the job. I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and told myself every small town had its superstitions. At the time, I believed that was all they were. A little after midnight, a county coroner's van pulled into the parking lot during a heavy rainstorm. A family followed behind it, their faces marked by shock and grief. Their son had died in a highway accident less than an hour earlier, and they begged me to prepare him immediately so relatives traveling from out of state could attend a viewing. I tried calling Garrett several times, but every call went unanswered. Standing there with the grieving family watching me, I remembered the first rule on the list he had given me: never embalm alone after dark. The instruction felt more like an old superstition than an actual warning. Believing there was no harm in helping the family, I unlocked the preparation room and began the work by myself. For the first half hour, everything seemed normal. Then a sudden wave of cold swept through the room. It wasn't the ordinary chill of air conditioning. The temperature dropped so sharply that my breath appeared in front of me. I checked the thermostat mounted on the wall. It still read 62 degrees, exactly where it was supposed to be. As I returned to my work, I heard footsteps crossing the floor behind me. The sound was slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing around the room. I spun around immediately, expecting to see Garrett, or perhaps a family member who had wandered inside. The room was empty. A few minutes later, the footsteps returned. Again, I turned. Again, there was nobody there. The pattern continued throughout the night, the sounds always beginning behind me and stopping the moment I looked. By the time I finished, my nerves were stretched thin. I cleaned my tools and prepared to leave, eager to get out of the room. As I reached for the light switch, something caught my attention near the narrow window overlooking the fenced courtyard. A single handprint was pressed against the glass. Every finger was perfectly visible in the condensation covering the surface. I stepped closer and felt my stomach tighten. The print was on the inside of the window, not the outside. The door to the courtyard had remained locked all night, and nobody had entered the room while I worked. I stared at the mark for several seconds, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Deep down, however, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I had broken the first rule, and something inside that building seemed to know it. 2 days after finding the handprint on the preparation room window, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe stress was affecting my judgment. Maybe I was letting Garrett's strange rules get inside my head. That morning, Pruitt & Sons hosted a viewing for an elderly man who had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The chapel was filled with family members sharing stories and comforting one another. Soft music played through the speakers while people moved quietly between rows of chairs. I was standing near the back of the room when I heard it. 3 slow knocks echoed from somewhere nearby. Knock. 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 The sound seemed to come directly from the sealed casket at the front of the chapel. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, expecting someone else to react, but nobody even glanced up. The mourners continued their conversations as though they hadn't heard a thing. Then I remembered the second rule Garrett had given me: never answer a knock from an empty viewing room. The wording suddenly felt far more serious than before. Without approaching the casket, I quietly left the chapel and went searching for Garrett. I found him in his office reviewing paperwork. The moment I mentioned the knocking, his expression changed. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. It lasted only a second before he returned to his usual calm demeanor. I asked him directly if he had ever heard sounds coming from a casket before. Instead of answering, he closed the folder on his desk and stared at me for several uncomfortable seconds. Finally, he told me I had done the right thing by leaving the room. When I pressed him for details, he refused to explain further. Some rules don't need explanations, he said. They only need to be followed. That answer irritated me more than it reassured me. I wanted facts, not cryptic warnings. Before I could continue questioning him, he dismissed me and returned to his work as though the conversation had never happened. The incident stayed with me for the rest of the day. Long after everyone had left, curiosity got the better of me. Shortly before midnight, I entered the security office and pulled up footage from the chapel cameras. I fast-forwarded until I reached the moment I remembered hearing the knocks. At first, nothing unusual appeared. Then the casket shifted. Not much, just a slight movement across the stand, but enough to make my blood run cold. Nobody was touching it. I replayed the footage twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. As I leaned closer to the monitor, the screen suddenly filled with static. White noise crackled through the speakers. The image distorted into flickering lines, completely obscuring what happened next. When the picture finally returned several seconds later, the recording had already skipped ahead, leaving a gap I couldn't explain. A week after the incident with the security footage, a young woman was brought to Pruitt & Sons following a sudden illness. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her family arrived carrying photographs that showed a bright smile and a life that had ended far too soon. While completing paperwork in the preparation room, I found myself repeatedly checking the identification documents to make sure every detail was correct. Her first name was unusual, and I kept rereading it to avoid making a mistake. As I organized the files, I quietly spoke the name to myself. Then I repeated it while comparing records. A few moments later, I said her full name once more while labeling a form. The instant the words left my mouth, every light in the room flickered. The overhead fixtures dimmed, flashed twice, and returned to normal. I froze. A familiar memory surfaced immediately. Never say a deceased person's full name 3 times. I stared at the folded list of rules pinned near the desk and felt a knot form in my stomach. Despite the strange timing, nothing else happened. The room remained silent. Eventually, I convinced myself the electrical system was simply old and continued with my work. 3 days passed without incident. I began feeling foolish for worrying about it. Then, late one evening, I caught something unusual in the reflection of a stainless steel storage cabinet. For a brief second, I thought someone was standing behind me. I turned around immediately, expecting to see another employee. The room was empty. When I looked back at the polished metal surface, the figure was gone. I told myself it had been a trick of the light. The following night, however, it happened again. This time, the reflection was clearer. A woman stood near the doorway, motionless and silent. She appeared only in the reflection. The moment I faced the actual doorway, there was nobody there. My pulse quickened as I slowly looked back toward the cabinet. Once again, the image had disappeared. Over the next several days, the sightings became impossible to ignore. The woman continued appearing in reflective surfaces throughout the building. I saw her in metal tables, polished equipment, and darkened windows after sunset. She never appeared directly in front of me. Only reflections revealed her presence. At first, she stood across rooms or at the ends of hallways. Then, the distance began shrinking. Each new appearance placed her slightly closer than before. One night, I noticed her reflection standing only a few feet behind me. Her expression remained blank, her eyes fixed on mine through the mirrored surface. I spun around so quickly that I nearly fell. Predictably, nobody was there. When I looked back at the steel cabinet, the reflection had vanished. Yet for the first time, I noticed something else. The faint outline of a handprint lingered on the metal exactly where she had been standing moments earlier. The strange reflections continued to haunt me, but another problem soon demanded my attention. One afternoon, while preparing the room for an evening service, I happened to glance at the thermostat mounted beside the preparation room entrance. The display read 68 degrees. At first, I assumed someone had adjusted it accidentally. The fourth rule clearly stated that the room must remain at exactly 62 degrees. Thinking little of it, I lowered the setting back to the correct temperature and continued my work. Several hours later, after finishing paperwork in the office, I returned to retrieve a file and noticed the display again. It had somehow climbed back to 68. No one had entered the room since I left. Slightly annoyed, I reset it a second time. When I checked again before midnight, the number had risen once more. By then, the situation felt less like equipment failure and more like something deliberately testing my patience. The following morning, I mentioned the issue to Odessa, an older employee who had worked at Pruitt & Sons longer than anyone else. Unlike Garrett, she rarely avoided questions. The moment I brought up the thermostat, her expression darkened. She remained silent for several seconds before asking me what date it was. When I answered, she nodded slowly. Then she told me about Irene, Garrett's wife. Years earlier, Irene had worked alongside him at the funeral home and was known throughout the county for her kindness. According to Odessa, Irene died unexpectedly inside the preparation room under circumstances nobody liked discussing. Every year around the anniversary of her death, strange things happened throughout the building. Doors opened without explanation. Clocks stopped. Most noticeably, the room temperature refused to stay where it belonged. Odessa claimed employees had spent years trying to find mechanical faults, but technicians never discovered anything wrong. Before walking away, she quietly advised me to keep the thermostat at 62 no matter how many times it changed. That night, I stayed late organizing records while rain tapped softly against the windows. Shortly after 1 in the morning, I entered the preparation room and immediately felt something was wrong. The air seemed unusually still. My eyes drifted toward the thermostat. The display showed 62 degrees. Relieved, I turned away. Then a faint clicking sound made me stop. I looked back and felt every muscle in my body tighten. The number on the screen was changing. 63, then 64, then 65. The digits climbed one by one as if invisible fingers were pressing the controls. I stood frozen near the doorway, unable to look away. No one was inside the room besides me. The temperature continued rising until it reached 68. Then the clicking stopped. A cold draft brushed past my shoulder, and for the briefest moment I thought I heard a woman whisper somewhere behind me. A few nights after witnessing the thermostat change on its own, a funeral service brought another unusual situation to Pruitt & Sons. The deceased was a retired farmer named Walter Hayes, a man who had spent nearly 50 years married to the same woman. His widow barely left the casket throughout the visitation. Long after relatives and friends departed, she remained seated beside him, quietly holding his hand and speaking in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. As closing time approached, she came to find me. Through tears, she explained that she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him alone for one final night. She asked for permission to stay in the chapel until morning. Her request immediately reminded me of another rule on Garrett's list. Overnight vigils required approval. Garrett had left earlier that evening and wasn't answering his phone. The woman was heartbroken, and denying her felt cruel. Against my better judgment, I agreed and unlocked the side entrance she would use if she needed anything during the night. Before leaving, I saw her return to the front row and sit beside the casket once again. The building remained unusually quiet for the next several hours. Around midnight, I passed the chapel and noticed her silhouette still sitting exactly where I had last seen her. A small lamp illuminated the front of the room while the rest remained in shadow. Sometime after 2 in the morning, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I finished my paperwork, checked the locks, and settled into the office for a few hours of rest. Nothing seemed out of place. When I woke shortly after sunrise, the funeral home felt strangely empty. I walked to the chapel expecting to find the widow preparing to leave. Instead, the room was vacant. Every chair stood undisturbed. The lamp had been switched off. Her purse, coat, and personal belongings were gone. So was her vehicle from the parking lot. At first, I assumed she had simply left early. Then I checked the visitor log near the entrance. There was no sign-out entry. In fact, there wasn't even a sign-in record from the previous evening. Confused, I reviewed the security footage. The cameras clearly showed the widow entering the chapel shortly before closing. They captured her taking a seat beside her husband's casket and remaining there for hours. I fast-forwarded through the night, expecting to eventually see her leave. That moment never came. Every camera angle showed the same thing. She entered the chapel, but none recorded her exiting. There were no blind spots large enough to explain it. My confusion turned to unease when I returned to the room for another look. The casket remained closed and untouched. However, something small rested on the carpet directly in front of it. Kneeling down, I picked it up and immediately recognized it from family photographs displayed during the visitation. It was Walter Hayes' wedding ring. According to his burial instructions, the ring had been placed on his finger before the casket was sealed. The discovery of Walter Hayes' wedding ring stayed in my thoughts for days. Neither Garrett nor Odessa could provide an explanation that made any sense. Garrett simply instructed me to focus on my responsibilities and avoid asking questions that had no answers. By that point, however, strange events had become impossible to ignore. Every week seemed to introduce something new. Late one evening, while completing my closing routine, I noticed something that immediately felt wrong. The back door of the preparation room stood partially open. The door was supposed to remain locked at all times. I knew I hadn't opened it, and no deliveries had arrived that day. As I approached, a cool breeze drifted through the gap. My eyes instinctively moved toward the folded list of rules pinned beside the office desk. Rule 6 was clear. Never investigate the back door alone. The warning echoed in my mind, but curiosity had already overcome caution. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The rain from earlier that afternoon had left the ground soft and muddy. Within seconds, I noticed footprints leading away from the building and disappearing into the woods behind the funeral home. They appeared fresh. Some were deep, as though whoever made them had been carrying considerable weight. I hesitated only briefly before following the trail. The further I walked, the quieter the forest became. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed absent. Branches scraped against one another overhead, while my flashlight illuminated patches of wet earth ahead. The footprints continued in a straight line through dense trees that grew increasingly difficult to navigate. Several times I considered turning back, but each step only strengthened my need to know where the trail ended. After nearly 20 minutes, the woods suddenly opened into a small clearing hidden from view by thick vegetation. At first I thought I had discovered an abandoned family cemetery. Weathered headstones stood among tall weeds and twisted roots. Most were decades old, their surfaces stained by time and neglect. As I moved closer, my unease deepened. Many of the names seemed familiar. I recognized them from funeral records stored at Pruitt & Sons. One by one, I read the inscriptions and realized every person buried there had passed through the funeral home at some point. Some deaths had occurred years apart, yet all of them had somehow ended up in this forgotten place. I walked between the graves until I reached the newest marker. Unlike the others, it looked recently placed. The soil surrounding it appeared freshly disturbed. My flashlight beam settled on the inscription, and the breath caught in my throat. There was no name carved into the stone, only a date. Today's date. I stood frozen, staring at it while a cold feeling spread to my chest. Then, I noticed something even worse. Beside the grave were a single set of fresh footprints leading away into the darkness beyond the clearing. After discovering the hidden cemetery in the woods, I stopped dismissing the rules as harmless traditions. Every strange event seemed connected to something older than the funeral home itself. I began carrying the list everywhere, studying it whenever I had a spare moment. The seventh rule was different from the others. It didn't warn against an action or forbid entering a particular place. Instead, it instructed employees to document every appearance of a specific name, Irene. At the time I first read it, the rule seemed oddly specific. After hearing Odessa's story about Garrett's late wife, I assumed it was simply a way of preserving her memory. Then the name started appearing where it shouldn't. The first occurrence was easy to overlook. While reviewing client records, I noticed Irene written faintly in the corner of a document that had nothing to do with her. I assumed someone had scribbled it years ago. Later that day, I found the same name scratched into the paint beneath a hallway window. 2 days later, it appeared again on the back of a maintenance checklist. Each discovery felt increasingly deliberate, as though someone wanted to make sure I noticed. Following the rule exactly as written, I began recording every occurrence in a notebook. Date, time, and location. Within a week, the list had grown surprisingly long. The name appeared inside storage rooms, on old invoices, and even on surfaces that should have been impossible to access. One evening, I unlocked a filing cabinet that had remained sealed for years according to company records. Inside, among stacks of aging documents, I found Irene carved into the underside of a shelf. The letters looked fresh despite being hidden inside a locked compartment. The more examples I collected, the more unsettled I became. Some seemed old. Others appeared only hours after I checked an area. Whenever I mentioned the matter to Garrett, he immediately changed the subject. Odessa simply advised me to continue documenting everything and never ignore a new appearance. Neither explanation satisfied me. Instead, my growing notebook convinced me that something inside the building was actively trying to communicate. My search for answers eventually led me into the archive room beneath the funeral home. Dust-covered boxes filled the shelves from floor to ceiling. While sorting through recent paperwork, I discovered a folder that had somehow been filed among current records despite looking decades old. Curious, I opened it and found an embalming report. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed the signature at the bottom. Irene Pruitt. A chill ran through me. According to every record I had seen, Irene had died 15 years earlier. Certain I was looking at an old document, I checked the date. My stomach dropped. The report had been completed only 2 days ago. I read it again and again, searching for some obvious mistake. There wasn't one. The handwriting was neat, professional, and unmistakably recent. Someone had processed a body inside Pruitt & Sons 48 hours earlier and signed Irene's name at the bottom of the report. Finding the embalming report signed by Irene shattered whatever skepticism I still possessed. I carried the document directly to Garrett's office and demanded an explanation. For the first time since I arrived at Pruitt & Sons, he didn't avoid the conversation. He stared at the report for several moments before quietly closing his office door. The tired expression he always carried seemed heavier than usual. Without saying a word, he unlocked a cabinet hidden behind a bookshelf and removed several old journals wrapped in faded cloth. Some looked more than a century old. He placed them on the desk and told me to sit down. What followed sounded impossible, yet after everything I had witnessed, I found myself listening. Garrett explained that the funeral home had existed in one form or another for generations. Long before the current building was constructed, local undertakers noticed strange occurrences surrounding certain deaths. Something seemed to follow the deceased from place to place. It wasn't a ghost, at least not in the traditional sense. According to family records, it attached itself to grief, loss, and the transition between life and death. Over time, it began appearing wherever the dead were gathered. Garrett opened one of the journals and showed me entries written by his ancestors. The pages described disappearances, voices coming from sealed rooms, and figures seen standing beside freshly prepared bodies. Eventually, the family discovered a way to contain whatever had entered their lives. They built a set of strict procedures around the funeral home. Those procedures evolved into the rules every employee received. I interrupted him and asked why he never explained any of this before. His answer chilled me more than anything else he had said. The rules were not created to protect workers from danger. They existed to maintain a prison. Every instruction reinforced barriers that kept the entity trapped within the property. Certain actions weakened those barriers. Others strengthened them. The family had spent generations maintaining the system without fully understanding the thing it contained. Garrett admitted that even he didn't know exactly what it was. He only knew what happened whenever the rules were ignored. As the realization settled in, I began mentally reviewing everything that had happened since my arrival. I embalmed the body alone after dark. I spoke a deceased woman's full name 3 times. I investigated the back door by myself. I approved an overnight vigil without permission. With every memory, Garrett's expression grew darker. Finally, he leaned forward and asked a question that made my stomach tighten. Had I noticed anything calling me by name? At first I said no. Then I remembered hearing faint whispers in empty hallways and seeing reflections that seemed focused entirely on me. Garrett nodded as though he had expected the answer. He explained that the entity learned through broken rules. Every violation allowed it to reach further beyond its confinement. Then he revealed the worst part. It no longer viewed me as an observer. It knew who I was, and once it learned a person's name, it never forgot it. The final night began shortly after sunset. Garrett had spent hours searching through old journals while I helped gather documents describing the original procedures used by his ancestors. According to the records, the barriers surrounding the funeral home had to be reinforced before dawn. If we failed, whatever had been trapped beneath the property would no longer remain confined. Almost immediately, the building began changing around us. Doors slammed without warning. Lights flickered throughout entire hallways. The first truly terrifying moment came when a casket inside the chapel slowly opened by itself. Then another, and another. None contained moving bodies, yet the sound of their lids creaking open echoed through the building like warnings. Minutes later, every telephone began ringing at once. Some lines had been disconnected for years. When I answered one, all I heard was distorted breathing followed by my name whispered from the other end. The temperature continued falling until frost formed across windows and metal surfaces. Before midnight, I saw figures moving through the corridors. They looked like former clients whose funerals had been held at Pruitt & Sons. Whenever I approached, they disappeared into shadows. As conditions worsened, Garrett and I followed instructions from the journals, restoring forgotten parts of the original containment process. We relocked sealed rooms, recovered missing records, and returned objects that had been moved over the years. Despite our efforts, the activity only intensified. Shortly after 2 a.m, I encountered the woman I had spent months hearing about. She appeared near the preparation room, standing beside the thermostat. Unlike the reflections that had haunted me before, this figure stood directly in front of me. Irene looked exactly as she appeared in old photographs. Calm. Tired. Real. She explained that her death had not been entirely accidental. For years she had remained behind to strengthen the weakening barriers whenever they began failing. Every appearance of her name, every strange warning, and every impossible document had been attempts to guide us toward the truth. She revealed that the funeral home had been built above an ancient burial site long forgotten by the outside world. Something buried beneath it had attached itself to the dead for generations, feeding on grief and fear while searching for a way to escape. With only hours remaining before sunrise, Irene guided us to a concealed chamber beneath the oldest section of the building. There we completed the final steps described in the journals and restored the original protections. The structure trembled violently as though something beneath it was struggling against the barriers. Then, just as dawn's first light reached the windows above, the shaking stopped. Silence returned. The funeral home survived. The strange activity gradually faded, and most of the secrets hidden within its walls remained buried. Months later, life seemed almost normal again. One evening, while reviewing my notebook of recorded incidents, I noticed a page I had never seen before. Written in unfamiliar handwriting was a new instruction. There had always been 7 rules. Now there were 8. The final line simply read, "If you ever hear your own voice calling from beneath the building, do not answer."